Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode in this five-part series.
A five-part deep dive.
Exactly, a deep dive into the Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Accident.
That's right.
And as we go through this deep dive, we're going to be using the IAEA's reports as our guide. And to get started, we're going to start with the very first document that the IAEA put out.
Yeah, chronologically, starting with the first report they put out. TV1.
TV1, that's right.
A first of many.
And it's a huge, very dense report.
Oh, yeah.
So over these 5 episodes, we're going to go chapter by chapter, chronologically, to really hopefully give you a clear picture of how these events unfolded, why they happened, and what are the key takeaways.
Yeah, trying to give people, I think, a solid grasp of this event, which was so significant, both for the nuclear industry and globally.
Okay, so let's jump into chapter 1 of this first report, which really kind of sets the stage for us. Of course, this begins with the Great East Japan earthquake and the massive tsunami that followed, which devastated the Fukushima Daiichi site. So, what happened? I mean, obviously, this is a huge earthquake.
It was.
The report mentions that it was a magnitude 9.0.
Yeah, it was a big one off the coast there.
Off the coast of Japan.
And it, as design, caused the automatic shutdown of reactor units 1 through 3, which is, I mean, it did what it was supposed to do, right? The reactor scrammed in response to that huge earthquake.
Well, that part's good.
But it was the tsunami that followed. That was really what set off this whole chain reaction of critical problems. Think station blackout.
Yeah.
The plant lost both its main and backup power sources.
So no power, and these reactors need constant cooling. What happens next?
Right.
I mean, they detail in this report all of the different cooling systems that reacted after the shutdown.
Yes.
Some of them automatically kicked in.
All right.
But the operators were also taking manual actions, desperately trying to stabilize the situation.
Exactly. And some of these decisions made under unimaginable pressure, I think, really highlight the complexity of what they were dealing with. For instance, in Unit 1, they actually manually stopped the isolation condenser system.
Whoa.
Because it was cooling the reactor pressure vessel too rapidly.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a big judgment call.
Yeah. Talk about a high-stakes judgment call.
Yeah.
You know, so that, and it wasn't just Unit 1 and Unit 3. The reactor core isolation cooling system, or RCIC as we'll call it, failed.
Okay.
Forcing them to switch to the high-pressure coolant injection system, HPCI.
HPCI.
But to conserve precious power, they opted to control it manually.
Wow. I mean, it just shows you, we talk about training these operators and all this stuff, but in the moment, they really had to think on their feet.
It really shows the challenging situation they were in. It wasn't just following procedures. They had to make choices, difficult choices.
Right.
And on the fly.
Based on the information they have. Yeah. And it wasn't just the reactors themselves. The report describes a real struggle to vent and depressurize the containment in Unit 2. And ultimately, that resulted in an explosion. In fact, the pressure readings went off the scale.
Yeah, so it was a perfect storm brewing.
Yeah.
You have this natural disaster, you have the power loss, and then these equipment challenges as well. But to understand this accident fully, we have to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And that includes the regulatory environment at the time, which the report delves into as well.
Okay.
It explains how Japan's nuclear regulations had evolved over the years.
Yeah.
And they had even incorporated lessons learned from previous incidents, like the JCO criticality accident, which was a major event in Japan's nuclear history.
Speaking of learning from experience, they even discuss how operators were trained using simulators.
Right.
Including simulators specifically modeled after the Fukushima Daiichi units.
Yeah.
I mean, it really highlights how vital preparation is.
Right. So it's not just about knowing the systems, it's about reacting under pressure.
Right. Which is something that those simulators are designed to do.
And in fact, the report notes that various potential earthquakes, grouped by location and type, were actually factored into the Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1 environmental permit.
Yes.
So they had considered earthquakes near the Japan Trench.
Right.
Earthquakes at plate boundaries.
Yep.
Even ones within the Earth's crust.
So they considered all those various types of earthquakes. They just didn't consider the tsunami.
The tsunami, yeah. It was clearly beyond their expectations. But here's a detail I found fascinating. They had installed these, they call them hardened vents.
Hardened vents.
Back in the 1990s.
Right.
Specifically designed to handle severe accidents.
Yeah, and they were really, it was a pressure release valve for the containment structures.
Right.
So if the pressure got too high, these vents would open and release that pressure to prevent a catastrophic, buildup of pressure in the containment.
Yeah.
And they had 2 paths for venting, one from the suppression chamber.
And another from the dry well. Just another layer of protection.
Another layer. And of course, there's the human side of this story.
Yeah.
The report gives an overview of all the personnel that rushed to the site after the accident. TPCO staff, contractors, specialists for power restoration, firefighting teams, radiation monitoring teams. I mean, it was a massive mobilization effort.
And think about the coordination involved in that.
Yeah.
The communication challenges. And the pressure to make the right calls in a very, very extreme situation.
Right. And the report then kind of goes into this very meticulous, step-by-step sequence of events, showing how the earthquake, the tsunami, and that loss of power all cascade into this meltdown. One detail that stood out to me was that Unit 4 was actually offline for a planned refueling outage.
Okay.
When the earthquake hit.
Right.
With all of its fuel assemblies stored in the spent fuel pool.
Yeah.
The SFP. And that kind of made me think, what are the implications?
Right, that's something to think about. What are the implications of a unit being offline like that in the middle of refueling during this event? It adds another layer of complexity to an already complex situation.
Right, and to further complicate things, each reactor unit had its own, unique characteristics.
Right.
They even provide a table that details key information about all 6 of the Fukushima Daiichi reactor cores.
Right.
Things like reactor type and full core power.
Right. So you've got, and this emphasizes that this was not a one-size-fits-all situation, right?
Yeah.
To understand the accident, you have to understand how each reactor responded differently to these events. And so that's the level of detail we're going to get into the IAEA report gives us.
And then comes the part about radioactive releases. And we learn about the types of elements that were released from these damaged reactors and their characteristics. For example, they detected lanthanum-140, which comes from the decay of barium-140. But there was no significant release of lanthanum itself. And they also didn't find any zirconium-95, meaning no major release of radioactive zirconium. So, we start to learn about the different elements.
And these details offer clues about what was happening inside the reactors as they melted down.
Right.
And that's crucial for understanding the environmental impact, right?
Right.
Because different elements behave differently in the environment and pose different risks.
Right.
So, just something to think about. How do you think the specific types of released elements affect the contamination of the environment and long-term health risks?
Right. That's a question we can definitely come back to.
We'll be exploring that in future episodes.
Yes, but the report does acknowledge that there are uncertainties in estimating the exact amounts of released isotopes, which I think is understandable.
Sure.
Given the chaotic nature of the events.
Yeah, under those circumstances.
But they do emphasize the significance of the release.
Right.
Both into groundwater and the ocean.
Right. So we know that there was a pretty significant release to the Pacific Ocean. And the report says that, in fact, the oceanic release from Fukushima Daiichi was the largest ever measured from a nuclear accident.
Wow.
Based on measured radionuclide concentrations.
So, talk about unprecedented.
Unprecedented, yeah.
And of course, there was an international response. The report summarizes the IAEA's involvement, including their reports to the Board of Governors, a ministerial conference on nuclear safety that followed. So it really does show that this is a global issue.
Right. Accidents like Fukushima have far-reaching consequences.
Like they do.
And it seems like international cooperation
is key
to learning from them and improving safety standards. What do you think is the most crucial role of international organizations in situations like this?
I think it's the sharing of information and the cooperation between countries. And the IAEA is uniquely positioned to do that.
Yeah.
Because they have the expertise and they have the access to all of these different countries. Now, one of the things that kind of startled me a little bit was that in Chapter 2 of the report, they kind of reveal this lack of reassessments at the Fukushima Daiichi site.
Yes.
Particularly when it comes to tsunami hazards.
Mm-hmm.
They hadn't really reevaluated those hazards. And they did that in contrast to international practice, which is to reevaluate those hazards periodically. The IAEA actually has safety standards that require a comprehensive evaluation of site-specific external hazards, things like earthquakes and tsunamis, before you even build the plant.
Right.
You're supposed to look at those things before you ever even break ground. So that was a pretty startling revelation from that chapter.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder why that wasn't standard practice in Japan at the time.
Right.
Because this chapter goes on to compare the Japanese approach to seismic hazard assessment
With international practices. And they point out a key difference. Japan didn't typically include safety margins to account for extreme events that they hadn't observed in their historical data.
Yeah.
Which, given that Japan's in a seismically active region, that's a little concerning.
Yeah, well, it's very concerning, right? I mean, they should be very concerned about earthquakes and tsunamis.
And it seems like they were.
Right.
But not to the extent that maybe they should have been.
Right. They were focused very much on historical data.
Right.
And maybe not enough on what could happen, but hadn't happened yet.
Right. And the report also points out that regulatory guidance on tsunami safety was limited in Japan at the time. There were no specific requirements or guidelines for reassessing tsunami hazards.
So it wasn't that they were doing it wrong, it's that there wasn't even a rule to do it right.
And that's kind of alarming.
Yeah.
And then this kind of gets into the meat of it.
Yeah.
They discuss TEPCO's own design basis for tsunamis.
Right.
And they explain how they use these historical records
Right.
and those deterministic methods
Right.
to establish the maximum tsunami height that this site should be prepared for,
Right.
which, as we know, turned out to be tragically flawed.
And their calculation was flawed. The tsunami that struck was far larger than they had anticipated. And they didn't take into account the possibility of a really large tsunami. And they also chose plant grade levels, which is the elevation of the buildings and structures, at 10 meters above sea level for units 1 to 4, and 13 meters for units 5 and 6, which turned out to be insufficient because the tsunami was much higher than that.
It really is a stark illustration of the limitations of relying solely on past events
Right.
to predict future risks.
Yeah.
You need to have a more robust approach
Right.
that considers those low probability, high consequence events. And there was a contrasting example
Yeah.
that was highlighted in the report,
Okay.
which was the Onagawa nuclear power plant,
Right.
which, despite being hit by the same tsunami,
Right.
their plant grade level was 14.8 meters
Right.
above sea level.
What's sea level?
And that was crucial in avoiding a meltdown,
Right.
like what happened at Fukushima.
And that just shows you how even those seemingly small differences in design
Right.
can have enormous consequences when you're facing these kinds of events.
Right.
And it's also worth noting that Onagawa, its location in Oriya, which is a coastal inlet with a kind of a V shape, likely amplified those tsunami wave heights. So the location also played a role.
Right. The geography of it.
Right. So the geography, the plant grade level,
Right.
all of these things played a role in determining the outcome.
So it's a multifaceted problem.
Right.
And the report stresses that site safety needs to be reassessed periodically,
Right.
incorporating new knowledge,
Right.
new hazards,
New data.
new regulations,
New methods.
industry practices. It's a call for constant vigilance and a commitment to continuous improvement.
That's right. And they highlighted the importance of independent peer reviews as a way to challenge those assumptions and make sure that potential risks are thoroughly evaluated.
So checks and balances, essentially.
Checks and balances, multiple perspectives.
Yeah. Okay, so now Chapter 3 takes us deeper into the plant's design
Right.
and how it reacted to these extreme events.
Okay.
One of the first things that they discuss is the alternate water injection system
Okay.
that was implemented between 1996 and 2002.
Right.
And it seems like this system was meant to get cooling water into the reactor if the primary emergency core cooling system failed.
Right. So for scenarios like a loss of core cooling or even a meltdown.
Right, so they were thinking about those scenarios.
You're thinking about it.
And trying to build in redundancy. Initially, this system used water from the fire suppression system, which wasn't seismically resistant. So not a good idea. But later in 2007, they upgraded it to use fire trucks with fixed connection points on the turbine building as the coolant source.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like they were, progressing in their thinking.
They were. They were realizing they needed a more dependable water source.
Right.
Yeah.
In emergencies. But remember, all those pumps in this alternate system were low pressure.
Okay.
Which meant the reactor and containment had to be depressurized before they could use it effectively.
And that brings us back to those challenges they faced with venting
Yeah.
and depressurization.
Right, because if you can't depressurize the reactor,
Yeah.
you can't use this alternate system.
And so they analyze how this system performed during the accident.
Right.
And note that venting from the wet well did allow for significant depressurization in units 1 and 3.
Right.
However, they were not successful with unit 2. And they cite the diet report's conclusion that despite several attempts, they couldn't depressurize Unit 2's containment. And it seems like the loss of DC power and high-pressure air meant they couldn't control those vent valves remotely.
Right, so they couldn't open the vents. They couldn't release the pressure.
And to make matters worse, the radiation levels in the reactor building by that point were so high that the operators couldn't get close enough to manually operate them.
So they were stuck. They were really stuck.
It was a chain reaction of failures, each one compounding the previous one.
Now, interestingly, Units 5 and 6 were actually in shutdown mode for refueling when this happened.
Right.
And amazingly, they managed to prevent a meltdown in those units. And they did this by directly connecting a power source from one of the air-cooled emergency diesel generators to the cooling equipment. So they were able to keep injecting cooling water using the makeup water condensate system and venting steam into the suppression chamber using safety relief valves to maintain pressure control.
So that was a clever workaround. They managed to keep those units stable.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Even though they had power for the cooling systems, the ultimate heat sink, which is, the system that dissipates all that heat into the ocean, was knocked out by the tsunami.
Right. So the cooling systems were working. They were able to inject water into the reactors, but they couldn't get rid of the heat that the reactors were generating.
And the seawater pumps and their motors were positioned at a lower elevation than the reactor building. So they were submerged and damaged by the tsunami. So even if all their normal safety systems had been available, they still couldn't have gotten rid of that heat.
They had no way to get rid of that heat.
Wow. It really shows that backup systems are only effective if they're not vulnerable to the same hazards as the primary system.
You need to think about those common cause failures.
And they did manage to restore the RHR system.
Residual heat removal system.
In Units 5 and 6, using temporary submersible pumps, and cooled the spent fuel pools in those units using similar methods. So even though they restored cooling, it was a reminder that tsunami's impact went far beyond just the initial wave.
Yes.
I mean, the damage it caused had ripple effects throughout the plant safety systems.
Right.
And it just wasn't anticipated.
Well, and they did say that the mechanical damage to essential safety system pumps was relatively limited. It was the tsunami that really crippled their ability to respond.
Right. That common cause failure again.
Yes.
And that's one of the things they emphasize in their kind of broader analysis of the accident. That the Fukushima Daiichi event really demonstrated that extreme natural hazards can potentially disable multiple layers of defense in depth.
Right, and that's a very important concept in nuclear safety. Defense in depth.
And what does that mean?
It means having multiple layers of protection. So if one layer fails, you've got another layer to back it up. And if that layer fails, you've got another layer. The idea is that no single failure should lead to a major accident. But what Fukushima showed us is that sometimes those extreme events can overwhelm multiple layers of protection all at once.
And that you have to consider those low probability, high consequence events in your design.
Absolutely.
Which maybe they didn't do to the extent that they should have.
That's one of the lessons learned.
And even when those primary systems fail, the report notes that alternative provisions and accident management capabilities can still be effective. You can still, if you have a good plan, you can still respond effectively.
But there are caveats. Those alternative systems require reliable instruments. You have to be able to monitor what's going on.
You need that data.
You need that data. You need simple and reliable ways to relieve pressure in the reactor so that whatever cooling methods you have available can be used. So it's about flexibility and adaptability when facing these unforeseen situations.
So then they go into this section about beyond design basis accidents. Which I think is particularly relevant here.
Absolutely.
Given the extreme nature of this event.
Because this is a classic beyond design basis accident. And they bring up a specific IAEA safety standard. Paragraph 6.37 from a document called NSR1, which states that adequate consideration shall be given to extending the capability to remove heat from the core following a severe accident.
So there was an understanding. That severe accidents could happen.
It's not that they didn't know.
And that preparedness was essential. And they even quote another IAEA safety standard, NSG 1.9, paragraph 4.81, which states, Equipment for emergency core cooling should be adequately protected from the consequences of internal and external hazards, such as seismic hazards, that have the potential to jeopardize its safety functions.
Right.
So again, there's this understanding that you have to think beyond the typical scenarios.
We'll have to think beyond design basis.
And consider these extreme events that could challenge even your most robust safety systems.
And so the report explicitly states that the Fukushima Daiichi accident exceeded the design basis of the units in several ways.
It seems like the accident's severity and complexity went beyond
It did.
what anyone had anticipated.
Right, and it was a multi-unit event, meaning several reactors were impacted simultaneously.
Yeah.
And that also was something that they hadn't really planned for.
Right.
And it left the operators with very little information about what was happening,
Right.
making it extremely difficult to control the situation.
And the report notes that neither the establishment permit, which outlines the plant's design and construction, nor the periodic safety reviews
Right.
conducted throughout the plant's operation included detailed analysis of these beyond design basis accidents.
And this wasn't in line with IAEA safety standards at the time.
Yeah, so that they were out of compliance with the IAEA standards. And the report says that one of the reasons they didn't thoroughly analyze a station blackout scenario was because of the assumption that power would be restored relatively quickly.
Right.
And they also believed that design features, like electrical cross connections between units, would be sufficient to mitigate a single unit blackout.
Right.
So they were relying on the assumption of quick recovery
Right.
and single unit events.
Right. Without adequately considering the possibility of a prolonged multi-unit blackout.
Right, like what happened.
Like what actually happened.
So their assumptions
were flawed. Yeah. And the report goes on to say that other beyond design basis accidents, such as a total loss of the ultimate heat sink, loss of DC power, and loss of spent fuel pool cooling, were also not assessed in detail.
So it seems like they were really focused on those design basis accidents.
Right.
So those events considered more likely.
Right.
And didn't fully address the potential for these rarer but far more severe accidents. And that's a crucial lesson, I think, learned from Fukushima.
Right.
You have to prepare for those low probability, high consequence events.
Absolutely.
Even if they seem unlikely.
Right. And the report then moves on to discuss accident management.
Okay.
And emphasizes the importance of procedures and guidelines for handling those beyond design basis accidents. They reference several IAEA safety standards documents, including NSR1, NSR2, NSG 2.2, and NSG 2.15, which all highlight the need for a comprehensive accident management program. And this program should include emergency operating procedures and guidelines for severe accidents, both of which should be symptom-based, meaning they focus on responding to the observed symptoms of the accident rather than trying to pinpoint the exact cause up front.
So it's a flexible approach that can adapt to the evolving situation.
Right, because you don't always know what's going on. You don't have time to figure out exactly what caused the problem. You just have to respond to what you're seeing.
And these procedures, according to the report, should cover everything from prioritizing actions, defining when to start and stop them, establishing time windows, outlining the necessary equipment and resources, even detailing potential positive and negative consequences of each action. So really thinking it through. Right. So it's about being as prepared as possible. Anticipating the challenges and the uncertainties operators are going to face during this severe accident.
And they emphasize that these accident management guidelines should cover the entire spectrum of credible beyond design basis accidents. Including factoring in everything from possible initiating events to potential complications caused by additional equipment failures, human errors, and those external events that we discussed earlier. So you have to think about all of those things when you're developing these accident management guidelines.
So then they explain that at Fukushima Daiichi, their specific emergency operating procedures were based on generic guidelines from the Boiling Water Reactor Owners Group, dating back to 1987. And then in 1992, the Nuclear Safety Commission of Japan recommended that utilities implement accident management measures to address severe accident conditions, which, shows they were thinking about this. And that recommendation led to joint research programs, plant-specific evaluations using probabilistic safety assessment methodologies, and the development of those accident management guidelines. And they submitted all those reports, to the Ministry of Trade and Industry in 1996. So it seems like they were actively working to improve their accident management capabilities.
Yes.
But the report points out that these improvements didn't necessarily translate into effective actions during the actual accident.
So they had the guidelines.
They had the guidelines.
But implementing them in such a high-stress, uncertain environment proved far more challenging.
So it's one thing to have a plan.
Right.
It's another thing to be able to execute that plan under extreme pressure.
That's right. Practice. Right.
Right. Practice. Great.
Oh, okay.
So then the report kind of shifts gears and talks about the governmental, legal, and regulatory framework for nuclear safety in Japan.
Right.
And it kind of divides the evolution of these organizations into 3 periods, each marked by, significant changes in response to events at nuclear installations.
So they were learning as they went.
Right. And adapting. And this is, it's interesting to see how they adapted, even before Fukushima, to past incidents. So the first period, from 1957 to 1978, saw the establishment of the Atomic Energy Commission, which was responsible for formulating basic policies on the peaceful use of atomic energy. And then there was the Atomic Energy Bureau within the Science and Technology Agency, which was responsible for the regulatory activities. So they were really laying the foundation. For governing nuclear energy in Japan. The second period, from 1978 to 1999, was marked by this move towards a more comprehensive approach to nuclear safety, emphasizing risk management and emergency preparedness. What do you think prompted this kind of shift in thinking?
Well, probably, 3 Mile Island. That was a major impact on the global nuclear industry, including Japan. They recognized they needed to strengthen their safety regulations and be better prepared for severe accidents.
Yeah. So those major accidents really do serve as catalysts for improvements. So those major accidents really do serve as catalysts for improvement.
They force you to reevaluate your assumptions and your practices?
Okay, so the third period, from 1999 to 2011, saw even more changes this time, spurred by the JCO criticality accident in 1999.
Another major accident in Japan.
Yeah, and the investigation committee for that accident recommended increasing the capacity and independence of the regulatory body. And improving the regulatory standards and guidelines for oversight and compliance.
So they wanted to make sure that the regulator was strong and independent, and that the rules were clear and enforced.
And so these recommendations led to several changes. Modifications in the licensing process for nuclear power plants, a clearer division of responsibilities between different ministries overseeing research and power generation, and changes within the regulatory organizations themselves.
So a pretty significant shakeup of the system.
It seems like, and it's also important to note that during this period, they enacted the Nuclear Emergency Act. And revised the regulatory guide on the technical aspects of nuclear emergencies.
So they were taking steps to be more prepared for these kinds of events.
They were recognizing that, accidents can happen. And you need to have a plan in place to deal with them.
Absolutely.
So the report then breaks down the roles and responsibilities of the various governmental organizations involved in nuclear safety. And in 2001, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, or NISA, was established within the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, and this agency took over the regulatory activities related to nuclear safety.
So they had a dedicated agency for nuclear safety within the government.
And at the same time, the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology, or MEXT.
MEXT, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, I know, right? Retain responsibility for certain scientific and technological aspects of nuclear energy.
So they had a division of responsibilities. NISA focused on the regulatory side. And MEXT handled the scientific and research aspects.
So kind of a checks and balances there.
In theory, yes.
In theory. So MEXT was responsible for policy development, for nuclear technologies, safety regulations for research reactors, protection against radiation hazards, and the use and transport of nuclear and radioactive materials.
So a pretty broad mandate.
And they also supervise key organizations like the National Institute of Radiological Sciences, the Japan Atomic Energy Research Institute, and the Japan Nuclear Cycle Development Institute.
So these are the organizations that are doing the research and development?
Right.
And the safety assessments related to nuclear energy.
So it's this complex network.
Yes, it is.
Of organizations, each with their own specific role in managing nuclear safety.
Right. And as we'll see, sometimes that complexity can lead to problems.
Right. Communication breakdowns, things like that.
Exactly.
So then the report kind of dives into the regulatory framework and the licensing process for nuclear power plants.
Okay.
And before constructing a plant, a licensee had to obtain an establishment permit, which specified the location, structure, and equipment of the plant.
So basically, the permit outlines the basic design and safety features of the facility.
And once construction was complete, they'd need a permission for operation to actually run the plant.
It makes sense.
But the report points out that the regulatory framework at the time didn't require licensees to submit the results of their periodic safety reviews to NISA.
Really?
Yeah. So before 2003 amendment, these periodic safety review reports were provided to the Ministry of Trade and Industry, which then reviewed them and reported to the Nuclear Safety Commission.
Okay.
But after that amendment, periodic safety reviews became mandatory, but they were still considered self-assessments, meaning the licensees weren't obligated to share those results with NISA.
So there was a gap in oversight.
It seems like if NISA wasn't directly reviewing those safety assessments, how could they ensure that the plant was operating safely?
Right. And the report does state that the regulatory body confirmed the adequacy of the periodic safety reviews during their inspections, but it doesn't provide details on the extent or rigor of those inspections.
Okay.
So we don't know how thorough those inspections were.
Right.
It also points out that these reviews didn't require a re-examination of the plant's design or a reassessment of external hazards in light of new standards data or methods.
So they weren't necessarily keeping up with the latest safety practices.
Right. They were relying on the operators to conduct thorough self-assessments and to identify potential safety issues.
But without a robust independent verification process.
Exactly. It's a point of vulnerability that the report clearly highlights.
Okay. Now, the report then discusses enhancements to the inspection system that were instituted in 2009.
Okay.
And these changes aim to introduce more flexibility and strengthen inspections during both plant operation and shutdown.
So they were trying to improve the inspection process, make it more comprehensive.
And what prompted those changes?
Well, partly they were driven by lessons learned from data falsification events that occurred in 2006.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They realized they needed more robust measures to ensure data integrity and prevent future incidents.
So it seems like they were learning and adapting, but sometimes those lessons came at a high cost.
That's often the case, unfortunately.
Okay, so the report provides a diagram illustrating the regulatory inspection process for nuclear power plants at the time of the Fukushima accident.
Okay.
And it shows a multi-layered process involving various inspections conducted by both NISA and JNES, the Japan Nuclear Energy Safety Organization.
So, on paper, it looks like they had a fairly comprehensive inspection regime in place.
Right.
But as we've seen, the events at Fukushima raised serious questions about the effectiveness of that regime.
Right. Those checks and balances weren't as strong as they perhaps should have been. Now, shifting gears to the human and organizational factors that contributed to the accident, the report states that the disaster wasn't solely caused by a lack of knowledge or information about the potential for a tsunami to cause severe damage to the Fukushima Daiichi plant.
Okay, so it wasn't just a technical failure.
Right. It was more than that.
It was a failure of systems and institutions as well.
Okay. And what do they mean by that?
They highlight a combination of factors, including organizational and regulatory systems that lacked a strong safety culture, a tendency to prioritize economic considerations over safety, and a failure to adequately address dissenting voices and concerns raised by individuals.
So it's this complex interplay of technical, organizational, and cultural factors.
Right. It's not just about having the right equipment or the right procedures. It's about creating a culture where safety is truly valued.
Right, and where people feel comfortable speaking up if they see something wrong.
Exactly, and the report emphasizes that the accident could have been averted if the regulatory bodies and the plant operator had adopted a more proactive approach to safety, challenged their assumptions, and taken concrete steps to address known vulnerabilities.
It's a powerful message about the importance of a strong safety culture.
Absolutely.
And it seems like that was lacking in this case.
Yes, a culture of complacency had developed within both the regulatory bodies and the plant operator.
Okay, and how did that happen?
They had become overconfident in their existing safety measures and failed to fully appreciate the potential consequences of a beyond design basis event.
So they were thinking about those smaller accidents.
Right.
The ones that are more likely to occur.
Right.
but
Right.
not those really rare but catastrophic events.
Exactly, and it's a human tendency to underestimate the likelihood of those rare events.
Right, because we don't want to think about those worst-case scenarios.
Right, but in the case of nuclear power, those worst-case scenarios can have devastating consequences.
Right, and this report really drives that point home.
It does.
So they dive into the specific organizational dynamics that contributed to this complacency.
Okay.
And one key issue they highlight is a lack of effective communication and coordination between the various organizations involved in nuclear safety.
Right, so even though they had multiple organizations with overlapping responsibilities,
Right.
they weren't working together effectively.
So those silos we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The lines of responsibility were blurred, and there was a lack of clarity regarding who had the authority to make critical decisions.
And that can lead to confusion and delays.
Exactly, especially in an emergency situation.
Right, when time is of the essence.
Exactly.
The report also highlights a tendency to avoid rocking the boat.
Meaning?
Meaning people were hesitant to raise concerns or challenge the status quo.
All right, they didn't want to get in trouble or jeopardize their careers.
And that can be dangerous.
It can be very dangerous because it stifles dissent
Right.
and prevents important information from coming to light.
Okay, so these communication breakdowns become even more apparent when the report analyzes the specific challenges faced during the emergency response.
Right, when communication is most critical.
Exactly. They point out that the loss of power to communication systems, coupled with a lack of clear procedures for communicating under extreme conditions, created chaos and confusion.
So it wasn't just the loss of their primary communication systems.
Right.
They weren't adequately prepared to communicate effectively using backup systems.
So they hadn't really thought through those worst-case scenarios.
No, they hadn't.
And the report provides specific examples of these breakdowns where critical information was delayed or misinterpreted, leading to delays in taking necessary actions.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. One example is the Prime Minister's visit to the Fukushima Daiichi plant on the morning of March 12th. During this visit, there was a discussion about injecting seawater into the reactors to cool them down, which seemed like a logical step, given the loss of their normal cooling systems.
Right.
But there was confusion and miscommunication regarding the Prime Minister's intentions.
Okay.
TEPCO personnel were initially unsure whether he had approved the seawater injection or not.
Oh, wow.
And this hesitation and confusion led to a delay in implementing the seawater injection, which potentially exacerbated the situation.
So a breakdown in communication at the highest level.
Right, and with potentially serious consequences.
It's a stark example of how communication breakdowns, especially under high-stress conditions, can have dire consequences.
And the report also points out the media's role in the communication challenges during the emergency response. They argue that the media's coverage often lacked context and accuracy, leading to widespread fear and confusion among the public.
So it's important for the media to report responsibly.
Right, especially during emergencies.
Especially when dealing with complex and potentially frightening events like a nuclear accident.
Right, because people are looking for information.
They are.
And if they're not getting accurate information from reliable sources,
Right.
they're going to turn to other sources which may not be as reliable.
Right, and that can lead to misinformation and rumors, which can make the situation even worse.
Okay, so the report also discusses the challenges the government faced when communicating with the public, particularly in the early days of the accident.
Right, because they were trying to figure out what was going on themselves.
Right, and they point out that there was a tendency to downplay the severity of the situation and withhold information which eroded trust and confidence in the government's response.
So it's that classic dilemma.
Right.
You don't want to cause panic,
Right,
but you also don't want to be seen as hiding information.
right.
And transparency and honesty are crucial for maintaining public trust and ensuring a coordinated and effective response.
Absolutely. And then the report explores the challenges faced in communicating with the international community, given the global implications of a nuclear accident. Communication with international organizations like the IAEA was critical.
Right, because they have the expertise and the resources to help.
Right, and the report states that there were delays and inconsistencies in the information shared with these organizations, hindering their ability to assess the situation and provide assistance.
So it seems like communication breakdowns occurred at multiple levels.
Right.
Within the plant, between the plant and the government, between the government and the public, and between the government and the international community.
Wow, it's just this complex web of communication challenges.
Exactly, and it all contributed to the difficulty in managing the crisis.
Okay, so then the report turns its attention to the regulatory response, analyzing the actions taken by NISA in the immediate aftermath.
Okay.
And I imagine they face their own set of challenges.
Absolutely. They were trying to assess the situation and coordinate a response,
Right.
but they were hampered by those communication breakdowns we discussed, and also by the sheer scale and complexity of the event.
So they were dealing with an unprecedented situation.
Right. And their existing systems and procedures weren't adequate to handle it.
Right. They weren't prepared for something of this magnitude.
And so the report highlights how the accident exposed the limitations of the existing regulatory framework.
Okay. And what were some of those limitations?
Well, one key issue was NISA's lack of independence from the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry.
So there's that issue of independence again.
Right. It seems like it played a significant role in the regulatory failures.
And why is that?
The report suggests that NISA's close ties to the ministry, which was responsible for promoting nuclear power, created a conflict of interest
Okay.
and potentially hindered its ability to act decisively and independently.
So they were too close to the industry they were regulating.
Right, and that can compromise their objectivity and their willingness to enforce safety standards.
Right. It's that classic fox guarding the henhouse scenario.
Exactly, and the report even cites a 2007 IAEA Integrated Regulatory Review Service mission to Japan, which had already identified a lack of clarity in the distinction between NICE's role and that of the Nuclear Safety Commission.
So concerns about the effectiveness of the regulatory framework existed even before the Fukushima accident.
Right? Those concerns were there, but they weren't addressed.
And the report also criticizes NISA's communication with the public during the emergency, stating that they often provided conflicting and confusing information, further eroding public trust and confidence.
So again, we see that communication is key.
Right. You need clear, consistent, and accurate information to maintain public trust,
Absolutely.
especially during a crisis.
Exactly.
And the report concludes this section by emphasizing the need for a strong and independent regulatory body with the authority to enforce safety standards and hold plant operators accountable.
So a call for reform in the wake of the disaster.
Right, a call for a more robust and independent regulatory system.
Exactly.
Now, the report then shifts its focus to the actions taken by TEPCO, the plant operator, during the emergency response. And this is where the report gets especially critical.
Okay.
This is where we really see the human factor come into play with all its complexities and failing.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's people who make decisions.
Right, and sometimes those decisions are flawed.
And sometimes those decisions have catastrophic consequences.
And the report doesn't hold back, stating that TEPCO made a series of errors and misjudgments that contributed to the accident's severity.
What were some of those errors?
Well, they were slow to recognize the severity of the situation and failed to implement necessary actions in a timely manner. They underestimated the potential consequences of a station blackout and didn't have adequate procedures in place to manage such an event.
So they weren't prepared for the worst-case scenario.
Right. And they were also criticized for their poor communication with the government, the public, and the international community.
Again, communication is key.
Exactly. The report highlights instances where TEPCO downplayed the risks, withheld information, and provided conflicting accounts of the situation.
So a lack of transparency and a reluctance to acknowledge the true extent of the problem.
Right. And the report even goes so far as to criticize TEPCO's corporate culture, describing it as lacking transparency, resistant to external oversight, and prioritizing profit over safety.
So a pretty damning indictment of their safety culture.
Right. It's a really harsh assessment.
It is, but it's based on the evidence.
Right. And the report concludes that TEPCO's failures played a significant role in the Fukushima disaster, and that fundamental changes are needed to prevent similar events from happening in the future.
So it's a call for accountability and reform.
Right. And it's a powerful message about corporate responsibility and the need for a strong safety culture within the nuclear industry.
Absolutely. And it's a message that needs to be heard loud and clear.
Okay, so the report then transitions to a discussion of the lessons learned from the accident and the implications for the future of nuclear safety.
Okay, so they're looking ahead now.
Right. They're trying to extract those valuable insights from this tragedy.
Exactly.
And they emphasize that the Fukushima disaster was a preventable event and that multiple opportunities were missed to prevent or mitigate its consequences.
So it wasn't just bad luck.
Right.
There were things that could have been done differently.
And it's not just about identifying what went wrong, but also understanding why those mistakes were made and how we can learn from them.
Right. We need to understand the root causes.
Right.
So that we can address them and prevent them from happening again.
And what are some of the key areas they identify for improvement?
They point to several, including a more robust assessment and management of external hazards, the design and operation of nuclear power plants, the regulatory framework, and the emergency preparedness and response systems.
So it's a comprehensive look at the entire system.
Yeah, from the technical aspects to the human and organizational factors.
Okay, and they also highlight the importance of international cooperation and the sharing of lessons learned.
Right, because nuclear safety is a global issue.
Absolutely.
We're all in this together.
Right now, one section that really caught my attention was the discussion of the accident's impact on the regulatory landscape in Japan.
Right, because it led to some Meiji changes.
It did, yeah. The Fukushima Daiichi disaster led to a fundamental reassessment of the country's nuclear safety regulations and a complete overhaul of their regulatory framework.
So they really shook things up.
They did. It was a turning point for Japan's nuclear industry. The accident exposed serious weaknesses in the regulatory system, leading to a loss of public trust and a widespread reevaluation of their energy policies.
So they had to rebuild from the ground up.
And what were some of the key changes they implemented in response to the disaster?
One of the most significant changes was the establishment of a new independent regulatory body called the Nuclear Regulation Authority, or NRA.
NRA.
The NRA has a broader mandate and greater authority than its predecessor, NISA, with a clear focus on safety and independence from vested interests.
So they learned that lesson about regulatory independence.
They did the hard way.
They did.
And they also implemented stricter safety standards, including enhanced requirements for seismic and tsunami protection, more robust accident management procedures, and improved emergency preparedness and response systems.
So they were trying to address all of those weaknesses.
Right. They were trying to close those gaps that were exposed by the Fukushima accident.
And it didn't stop there. Japan's nuclear industry has undergone significant restructuring, with a greater emphasis on transparency, accountability, and a culture of safety.
So it was a top-to-bottom overhaul.
It was a complete transformation.
And it was driven by the need to regain public trust.
Absolutely, because without public trust, they couldn't move forward.
Exactly.
Now, Chapter 2 of this report really emphasizes the importance of reassessing those site-related safety aspects, and they stress the need to consider new knowledge and data, particularly when it comes to seismic and tsunami hazards.
Right, we can't just rely on the past.
Right, we have to be constantly evaluating and updating our risk assessments.
Exactly, and they even suggest using what they call global analogs to inform those assessments.
Global analogs?
Yeah, for instance, since an earthquake with a magnitude of 9.5, the largest ever recorded,
Wow.
had occurred in the same tectonic environment as the Japan Trench, they should have considered that as a possible scenario.
That seems like a pretty obvious point. Yet it's clear they weren't adequately considering those extreme but still possible events.
Right. They were focused on what had happened in the past,
Right.
not on what could happen in the future.
And the report also criticizes TEPCO's approach to assessing tsunami hazards.
Okay.
They relied too heavily on historical records and those deterministic methods,
Right.
which didn't fully capture the potential for those rare, massive events.
And their assessment was also hampered by a lack of transparency and independent review.
Okay, so their internal discussions and calculations weren't rigorously scrutinized by outside experts.
Right. It was a closed system with very little input or challenge to their assumptions.
And this lack of transparency extended to their communication with the regulatory authorities. The report notes that TEPCO didn't fully share their tsunami hazard assessments with NISA.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the regulatory body wasn't fully aware of the potential risks.
It's another example of how a lack of communication and transparency contributed to this disaster.
Right. And it's a theme that we see over and over again.
Unfortunately, yes.
Now, Chapter 3 takes us into the design of the plant itself,
Okay.
specifically focusing on the reactor containment systems and their ability to withstand extreme events.
Right. Because the containment structure is the last line of defense.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's what's supposed to prevent those radioactive releases.
Exactly.
And it explains that the Fukushima Daiichi reactors used what's known as a Mark-I containment structure, a common design for boiling water reactors at the time.
Okay.
And the Mark-I containment was designed to withstand a certain level of internal pressure,
Right.
but it wasn't built for the extreme forces generated by a massive earthquake and tsunami.
And that design flaw turned out to be fatal.
It did. The report details how those tsunami waves overwhelmed the plant's seawalls, flooding critical areas like the backup generators and the electrical switchgear that control the cooling systems.
Right.
And that resulted in that infamous station blackout we talked about.
Right. The loss of all power.
Exactly, which ultimately deprived the reactors of the power they needed to cool down.
And that loss of cooling, combined with the damage to the containment structures, ultimately led to the meltdown of the reactor cores.
So it was a combination of factors.
Right. multiple failures cascading upon each other.
And the report highlights the vulnerabilities of that Mark-I containment design,
Okay.
noting its relatively small volume and limited ability to vent pressure.
So even if they had been able to vent pressure from the reactors,
Right?
the containment structure itself might not have been able to handle it.
Right, it would have been overwhelmed.
Exactly.
Wow, and the report contrasts the Mark-I design with other containment types such as the Mark II, which was used in Unit 6 at Fukushima Daiichi.
Okay.
The Mark II containment was larger
Right.
and had a more robust system for suppressing pressure.
So a better design.
It seems like it, yeah, and that difference in design made a difference in outcome.
Yes. The report points out that Unit 6, despite being hit by the same tsunami, did not experience a meltdown.
Really?
Yeah, so that really highlights how the containment structure played a crucial role in the severity of the accident.
It's tragic to think that this disaster could have been prevented or at least mitigated if they had used a more robust containment design.
It is a reminder that design choices have consequences.
Right.
Especially when dealing with high-risk technologies like nuclear power.
And the report also discusses those hardened vents that were installed in the Fukushima Daiichi reactors back in the 1990s.
Right, those pressure release valves.
Exactly, and they were meant to provide a controlled release of pressure from the containment in an emergency.
So they were aware of the potential for overpressurization.
Right, they were trying to build in some safeguards.
But the report notes that those vents weren't used effectively during the accident.
Really?
They were either inaccessible because of the damage and flooding, or operators were hesitant to use them due to concerns about releasing radioactive material into the environment.
So it's a tough call.
It is.
You have a safety system designed to prevent a catastrophic failure, but using that system could also have negative consequences.
Right. It's a dilemma engineers and operators often face when dealing with complex systems.
And it highlights the need for those really clear and well-defined procedures.
Absolutely. You need to know when to use those safety systems and what the potential consequences are.
Right. And then the report goes into a very detailed analysis of how the plant responded to that station blackout.
Okay.
And it highlights those cascading failures that occurred in the hours and days after the tsunami.
Right. It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. One failure leads to another and another and another.
And it can be very difficult to stop that chain reaction once it starts.
And that's what happened at Fukushima.
It did.
The plant safety systems simply weren't designed to cope with such a prolonged loss of power.
Right. They were designed to handle short-term outages.
Right.
But not something like this.
Okay, so it wasn't just one thing that went wrong. It was a series of failures, each one building upon the last.
Exactly. And the report explains how the loss of power disabled not only the normal cooling systems, but also the backup cooling systems, and even the instrumentation and control systems that allowed operators to monitor what was happening inside the reactors.
So they were flying blind.
Essentially, yes. They lost all control.
And that loss of control ultimately led to the meltdown.
It did. The reactors overheated and the fuel rods melted.
Right. And the report also looks at the actions taken by the operators during the emergency.
Okay.
And they faced immense challenges.
They did.
Including a lack of information, conflicting guidance from different authorities, and extremely hazardous conditions inside the plant.
It's hard to imagine the pressure they were under.
Right, trying to make those life or death decisions with limited information and resources.
And the report doesn't shy away from criticizing some of the operators' actions.
Okay.
But it also acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances they were facing.
Right, they were in a no-win situation.
It's a nuanced and balanced assessment of the human element in this disaster.
Right. It's important to remember that the operators were also victims of this event.
They were.
And they were doing their best to respond to a rapidly evolving and highly dangerous situation.
Absolutely. They were trying to do their jobs under incredibly difficult circumstances.
Okay, so now let's shift our focus to the emergency response, both on-site and off-site.
Okay.
The report provides a detailed timeline of events, highlighting the challenges and successes of those response efforts.
So we're looking at how they managed the crisis.
Right, how they tried to contain the damage and protect the public.
And the report points out that the initial response was hampered by those same communication breakdowns and lack of preparedness that contributed to the accident itself.
So those same problems kept coming up.
They did. There was confusion about the severity of the situation, and critical decisions were delayed or mishandled. They also criticized the government's communication with the public.
Okay.
They were slow to release information and often downplayed the risks, which created a sense of distrust and fear among the population.
Again, we see the transparency and honesty are crucial for maintaining public trust during emergencies.
Absolutely. You need to be upfront with people about what's happening.
Right, even if it's bad news.
Right, because trying to hide the truth will only make things worse in the long run.
But amid the challenges, the report also highlights the heroic efforts of the plant workers and emergency responders who risked their lives to contain the accident and protect the public.
Right. They were true heroes.
They were?
They put their own lives on the line to try to save others.
Absolutely. And it's a testament to their courage and dedication that the situation didn't spiral even further out of control.
It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always people who are willing to step up and do the right thing.
Now, the report also delves into the long-term consequences of the accident, specifically the environmental and health impacts.
Okay.
This is where we really see the truly devastating and long-lasting effects of a nuclear disaster.
Great, because the consequences of these accidents can last for decades or even centuries.
It's exactly. The meltdown released a significant amount of radioactive material into the environment, contaminating the air, water, and soil in the surrounding area.
And that contamination led to the evacuation of tens of thousands of people and the establishment of an exclusion zone on the plant, a zone that remains in place to this day.
It's a stark reminder of the profound and long-lasting impact these events can have on communities and the environment.
Absolutely. It's a scar on the landscape and on the psyches of those who are affected.
And what about the health effects of radiation exposure?
The report discusses this complex issue, noting that the risks are difficult to quantify precisely, but it does highlight the increased risk of certain cancers, particularly thyroid cancer, among those exposed to the radiation.
So a tragic legacy of this disaster.
It is, but it's important to remember that the vast majority of the population received very low doses of radiation, comparable to natural background levels.
So for most people, the health risks were minimal.
Right, but there were groups that received higher doses, including the emergency workers who were directly involved in responding to the accident and residents of certain areas that were more heavily contaminated.
And for those individuals, the risks were understandably higher.
Right, and the report addresses those specific concerns, discussing the types of health effects that are associated with radiation exposure, the factors that influence those risks, and the challenges of estimating the long-term health consequences.
Right, because those consequences can take years or even decades to manifest.
Exactly.
They also highlight the importance of ongoing monitoring and health surveillance for those who are exposed to higher levels of radiation, ensuring they receive appropriate medical care and support.
Right, because even though the immediate danger may have passed, the long-term health effects need to be carefully monitored and managed.
It's about recognizing that the impacts of this disaster will continue to be felt for decades to come and providing those affected with the resources and support they need.
Absolutely. It's a long-term commitment.
Right. And it's not just about the physical health effects.
Right.
The report also acknowledges the psychological and social impacts of the accident. The stress, anxiety, and fear experienced by those who were evacuated from their homes, who lost loved ones, or who are still living with the uncertainty of the long-term consequences.
Right. Those psychological and social impacts can be just as devastating as the physical impacts.
Exactly. And it's important to provide support for those who are struggling with those issues.
Absolutely. It's a holistic view of the disaster, taking into account those human, social, and environmental dimensions.
And as we move into Chapter 6, we see that the report delves into those broader societal impacts, exploring the economic, social, and political consequences of the Fukushima Daiichi accident.
Right, because these accidents don't just affect individuals.
Right, they affect entire communities, regions, and even nations.
Exactly.
And this chapter really expands the scope of our understanding, moving beyond the technical and environmental aspects to consider the wider implications of this disaster for Japan as a nation.
So it's a big picture view.
It is, yeah.
And the report analyzes the economic costs of the accident, including the damage to the plant itself, the cleanup and decontamination efforts, the compensation paid to those who were affected, and the loss of productivity due to the disruption of businesses and infrastructure.
So a massive economic impact.
It was a huge financial burden for Japan.
Right, and those costs continue to accrue as the cleanup and recovery efforts continue.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process.
The report also examines the social impacts. Right. Exploring the displacement of community.
Right, the loss of homes and livelihoods.
The disruption of social networks, the psychological trauma experienced by those who are directly affected, and the stigma associated with radiation exposure.
It's a reminder that these accidents don't just damage buildings and ecosystems.
Right.
They disrupt lives, communities, and social structures.
Okay. And the report also touches upon the political consequences of the accident, discussing the public's loss of trust in the government and the nuclear industry, the changes in energy policies, and the debate over the future of nuclear power in Japan.
Right. The accident really shook people's confidence in nuclear power.
It did.
And it forced the government to reevaluate its energy strategy.
Right, and it's still a topic of debate today.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to Chapter 7, we see the report shift its focus to the international response to the accident, exploring the role of organizations like the IAEA in providing assistance, sharing information, and facilitating cooperation.
Right, because these kinds of accidents have global implications.
They do.
They require international cooperation.
Right, and this chapter really highlights the importance of a global perspective on nuclear safety.
Absolutely, we're all in this together.
Accidents like Fukushima have implications that extend far beyond national borders,
They do.
requiring international collaboration and support.
Right, and the IAEA is really the key organization for coordinating that response.
Right. And the report details the IAEA's involvement in the aftermath of the accident, from their initial assessment missions and technical assistance to their ongoing monitoring and support for Japan's recovery efforts. It also discusses the role of other international organizations, such as the World Health Organization and the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, in providing expertise and resources.
So it was a truly global effort
It was.
to respond to this disaster.
And the report emphasizes the importance of transparency and communication in the international response, highlighting the need for timely and accurate information sharing, open dialogue, and coordinated action.
Right, because trust is essential,
It is.
especially in these kinds of situations.
Right. You need to be able to trust the information you're getting.
Exactly.
Okay? And as we move into Chapter 8, we arrive at the heart of the report,
Okay.
the lessons learned, and the recommendations for improving nuclear safety in the wake of the Fukushima Daiichi accident. This is where the report distills its vast amount of information and analysis into actionable insights for the future.
So they're taking all of those findings
Right.
and turning them into concrete steps that can be taken to prevent similar accidents from happening again.
Right. It's about making sure that this tragedy isn't repeated.
Absolutely.
And what are some of the key areas they identify for improvement?
Well, they point to several, including a more robust assessment and management of external hazards, enhanced design and operation of nuclear power plants, a stronger and more independent regulatory framework, and a more comprehensive and integrated approach to emergency preparedness and response.
Okay, so it's a pretty broad set of recommendations,
Is.
covering everything from the technical to the human to the organizational.
Right. It's a systemic approach to safety.
Okay, and they emphasize the importance of a safety culture that prioritizes vigilance, transparency, and continuous improvement.
Right, because safety is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process.
Right, it requires constant attention and effort.
Exactly. And they advocate for a shift from a reactive approach to a proactive one,
Right.
where potential risks are identified and addressed before they can escalate into accidents.
So it's about being ahead of the curve.
Right. It's about anticipating problems and taking steps to prevent them.
Right, and they also highlight the importance of strong and independent regulatory oversight,
Absolutely.
ensuring that safety standards are met and that plant operators are held accountable for their actions.
Right, because the regulator needs to be a watchdog.
Right, they need to be able to hold the industry's feet to the fire.
Exactly.
And they call for a more integrated and collaborative approach to emergency preparedness and response, involving all stakeholders from local communities to international organizations.
Right, because everyone has a role to play in ensuring nuclear safety.
Right, it's a shared responsibility.
It is.
And the report concludes with a call to action urging the global nuclear community to learn from the mistakes of Fukushima and to work together to build a safer and more sustainable future for nuclear energy.
It's a powerful message.
It is.
And a timely one.
Right. We can't afford to forget the lessons of Fukushima.
No, we can't.
We have to make sure that something like this never happens again.
Absolutely.
And with that, we've reached the end of this first deep dive into the IAEA's reports on the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident.
It's been a long and complex journey,
It have.
but I think it's been a worthwhile one.
I agree.
We've uncovered a lot of information,
Yeah.
and we've gained a deeper understanding of the causes and consequences of this disaster.
And I think we've also gained a better appreciation for the challenges of nuclear safety.
Right. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
But it's an issue that we have to address
We do.
if we want to continue to use nuclear power.
Right. And if we want to use it safely.
So we hope you'll join us for the next 4 episodes in this series as we continue to explore the IAEA's reports and delve deeper into the lessons learned from Fukushima.
We'll be looking at the technical details, the human factors, the regulatory framework, and the long-term consequences of the accident.
And we'll be discussing what steps can be taken to prevent similar disasters from happening in the future.
So we hope you'll stay tuned.
Thanks for listening.